I just started the recording. So let me say what I was saying until now, just in a few sentences, because I just started the recording of meeting 4. The goal of me showing you the book of Ruth was to show you what I called biblical prophetic style. It's easy to see it in the book of Ruth because the book of Ruth is not a regular book of prophecy. It's in the hagiographa. It's a story. But since the author of the book of Ruth, according to our tradition, was Samuel the prophet, he uses symbols very liberally because that's the style of prophets in general. Now, as I said before, just like poetry, especially prose, uses symbols in order to express something which is not necessarily logical, like emotions, and you use it, then a symbol will be used or a metaphor will be used in order for somebody to feel the emotion. I'll give you an example actually from the Bible. In the book of Isaiah, in chapter 8. Yes, in Isaiah chapter 8, if somebody wants to find it, it is verse, no, I think it's 7. One moment. Chapter 7. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 2. If somebody wants to read it, s'il vous plaît. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 2.
Yes. Pântecele tău este un pahar rotund, de
Wait,
unde nu
I want to make sure we have the
lipsește.
same verse. And it was told to the house of, oh, you're starting from the beginning. And it came to pass on the days of Achaz. Yes? Achaz, the son of Yotam. Yes?
Nu.
We are talking about Isaiah.
Isaiah chapter 7, 7, capitolul 7, the prima verse.
S-a întâmplat pe vremea lui Ahaz, it's the first.
Yes. Okay. So just the first two verses I want.
S-a întâmplat pe vremea lui Ahaz, fiul lui Yotam, fiul lui Ozia, împăratul lui Iuda, că Rețin, împăratul Siriei, s-a suit cu Pecah, fiul lui Ramalia, împăratul lui Israel, împotriva Ierusalimului ca să facă război, dar n-au putut să-l asedieze.
Okay, so that's the first verse. Now the second verse.
Când au venit și au spus casei lui David, sirienii s-au aliat cu Efraim, inima lui Ahaz și inima poporului său au tremurat cum se clatină copacii din pădure când bate vântul.
Okay, I'll tell you what it says in English. It says, and it was told to the house of David, saying, the house of David means Judea, because remember, there's the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So in the southern kingdom, the king, the house of David, was told, Aram, which came from the north, is now working together with Ephraim. It's a confederate of Ephraim. Ephraim is the northern kingdom. And his heart was moved and the heart of his people as the trees of the forest are moved with the wind. Right? That's what it says. So, in other words, the southern kingdom was told that Aram, got together with the northern kingdom, and now the southern kingdom was afraid of being attacked. And it said that his heart and the heart of his people moved just like trees moving in the wind. What does that mean? Tell me what that means in 2 words.
Back and forth.
In 3 words. What?
It's just like it's moving back and forth.
Yes, but what is this analogy? What are they trying to say from the analogy? What does it mean their heart and the heart of the people moved from its place like trees blow in the wind? What does that mean? Tell me in simple language what they're saying.
They went and they came back. This is what I understand.
No.
No, it's not this.
No? Mirella, what do you want to say? Mirella, I see you put up your hand.
Oh, you ignored me 10 minutes ago.
I'm sorry, I don't always see the hand.
Could be very emotions.
Yes, which emotion? Very good, which emotion?
Very happy. Very satisfied.
Nope. Again, Aram, which was an enemy of the northern kingdom and also an enemy of the southern kingdom, all of a sudden made an alliance with the northern kingdom. What is the southern kingdom now thinking? What is the southern kingdom thinking about this alliance?
Fear.
What did it say in verse 1? That Aram and the northern kingdom came to fight against the southern kingdom. That was verse 1. The southern kingdom is the kingdom of David, meaning the son of the son of the son of the son of David. But I mean, it's called the house of David. It's not clear. You have Aram, the northern kingdom, came to war against the southern kingdom. And even though they were not able to win, but it says about the southern kingdom, when they saw the enemy coming against them, their heart moved from its place, just like the trees are blowing in the wind. What does that mean, that your heart moves from its place like trees blowing in the wind? Tell me in simple language, what does it mean?
They were scared.
Exactly. Radu, you hit the nail on the head. They were afraid. You have all these people, it's two different, the northern kingdom and Aram coming at you at the same time. They were afraid. So why don't you just write they were afraid? Why do you have to say their heart moved from its place like trees blowing in the wind? Why do I need that for? What do I need all these metaphors? What does it add to the story?
Emotion.
Motion and tension a little bit.
Okay, in other words, it tells me, what does it tell me more than they were afraid? When I use a metaphor, what is it saying? I can say they were afraid, but if I say that their heart moved like trees blowing in the wind, what does that really mean?
The intention of frightened.
The amount of fear.
Amount, yeah.
They were really
It was
afraid.
intense. It was
They were
powerful.
really afraid. Okay? Because when they say they're afraid, they're afraid. But if you say that their hearts were moving like trees blowing in the wind, and you can imagine large trees blowing in the wind, they say, wow, they were really afraid. So the metaphor here and the symbol is to tell you, to express the emotion. They weren't just afraid. They were, okay, they were besides themselves. They didn't know what to do. They thought this was the end. And the fact that the war was over and they were able to survive, I'm sure they had post-trauma after that. So the metaphor in prose is there to express to you how much they were afraid. Because if you just say they were afraid, okay, they were afraid. I don't know how much. But if you say like trees blowing in the wind, right? The trees look like they're about to fall out of the ground and die. I mean, that's how afraid they were. They thought the end was very near. So emotion needs metaphors to express it. But symbols can express various things. Let me give you an example of symbolism in the Bible. And let's take the book of Genesis. Go right to the beginning to chapter 5. Okay, do you have Genesis chapter 5? No, chapter 4, excuse me. Chapter 4.
With Cain and Abel?
Yes. Let's take it from verse 3.
Yeah, but I have it in English. I don't know.
Okay, well, who has it in Romanian? Verse 3. And during the time it came to pass that Cain brought the fruit of the ground. Who has that in Romanian?
Un timp oarecare.
Yes, Genesis. Genesis capitolul 4 and it's number verse 3. Verse 3. That during this time, yes.
După un
Și a
timp,
fost,
ah,
da, scuză-mă,
Yes, please, if somebody can read. Verse 3.
spune tu.
și a fost că după un timp Cain a adus din roadele pământului jertfă lui Dumnezeu și a adus și Abel din cele întâi născute ale oilor sale și din grăsimea lor. Și Domnul a căutat spre Abel și spre darurile lui, dar spre Cain și spre darurile lui n-a căutat. Și s-a umplut Cain de mânie și fața era posomorâtă. Și Domnul Dumnezeu i-a zis lui Cain: de ce te-ai mâniat și de ce ți este fața posomorâtă? Dacă tu faci bine, nu vei fi oare bine primit? Dar de nu faci bine, păcatul stă pitit la ușă, pe tine te poftește, dar tu cată să-i fii stăpân. Și Cain a zis către Abel, fratele său: să ieșim la câmp. Și a fost că în timp ce erau ei pe câmp, Cain s-a aruncat lui Abel, fratele său, și l-a omorât. Și a zis Domnul Dumnezeu către Cain: unde este Abel, fratele tău? Iar el a zis: nu știu, nu cumva sunt eu paznicul fratelui meu? Și a zis Domnul: ce ai făcut? Glasul sângelui fratelui tău strigă spre mine din pământ. Și
Ok.
acum blestemat să fii de pământul ce și-a deschis gura ca să primească din mâna ta sângele fratelui tău.
Okay, merci. Find me the metaphors in this story. Where are the metaphors in this story?
May I?
Yes, please.
I guess the most obvious is even the last one, the mouse of the earth who gets the blood of his brother, and
Right, the blood of your brother is screaming to me
this
from the
one.
earth. Now, obviously, blood does not scream.
Yeah.
That's obvious. So you say the blood of your brother is screaming, which means this injustice is crying to heaven. That's what we'd say. It's a terrible injustice. I can hear the blood screaming, mean this is a terrible injustice, right? But it's a metaphor. It's in order to feel that this is a terrible injustice. So we say the blood of your brother is screaming from the ground. And of course, Cain, though, tries to, like we all do whenever we're caught red-handed, tries to make it not so important, like, am I in charge of my brother? That's my job. So, but whenever we're caught red-handed, it's like that. Or it's like Adam, right? Adam, Eve, and the snake. So God says to Adam, why did you eat from the tree? He says, me, the woman that you gave me, she brought it to me. And you pass the responsibility. And then he says to the Eve, why did you eat from the tree? Me, that serpent. Right? It's always somebody else, right? So yeah, so that's, it's the human nature. Either we pass the responsibility to somebody else, it wasn't us, or or we say we were never responsible. I'm not responsible for my brother. I'm not his father. I'm not his mother. Should be somebody else, right? Yeah. But there are other things here too. Let me give you another example, which made the Bible commentaries very puzzled. It's in verse 8. In verse 8. Verse 8 says, and Cain said to Hevel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field, Cain rose up against Hevel his brother and slew him. What does it say in Romanian? The same? Now, there's some problems in this verse. It says, and Cain said to Hevel his brother, but it doesn't say what he said. And then it says, and when they were in the field, he slew his brother, which means he killed his brother. So there are two things here. Number one, what did he say? Now, this question of what did he say was a problem for a lot of commentators. If you look, for instance, in the Septuagint and in the Samaritan Bible, which is also an old Bible, the ones that are kept here in Nablus by the Samaritan ethnic group that live here in Israel. So in both these Bibles, it says they added a few words because it bothered them, that verse. Because it says, and Cain said to Hevel, but it doesn't say what he said. So it said, and so they, in the
In my
Septuagint,
version, it says.
I'm sorry?
In my version says, "Let's go outside."
Exactly,
on the
that's based on the Septuagint. The Septuagint translates it, adds to it, let's go into the field. Let's go to the field, because later on it says, in the field, he killed him. So both the Samaritan version and the Septuagint says, and Cain said to Hevel, let's go to the field. But in the Masoretic text, in the Jewish text, it doesn't say, let's go to the field. It just said, and he said to Hevel, and it doesn't say what. And in my opinion, this is much stronger, because you know what? He was looking for an excuse. It didn't matter what he was going to say to his brother. When you are angry and you want to beat somebody up, whatever they say is going to sound bad. Okay,
And
if they
when
say
you murder someone, you don't say it, let's go to, I mean, it's too childish. So
that's right.
you don't have to.
Right. If you don't like somebody, you start looking at them, you say, huh? You say something? You say, no, I just said the sky is blue. Oh, the sky is blue, which means I'm bad, right? That's what you meant? And whatever they say, right? It's called picking a fight. So that says, in other words, Cain said something to Hevel, to Abel, his brother, but it's totally insignificant, whatever he said, because he was trying to pick a fight. And then they went out to the field, and that's where he killed him. Now, my second question is, why does it say they went out to the field?
To be far away from other people.
Okay,
You
that's,
don't kill somebody in the middle of the citadel.
of course, there weren't a lot of other people at the time. So there are lots of places they could go. But yes, obviously, in general, it's when a person's in an unprotected area, so obviously it's easier. But if you look in biblical literature in general, the field always is always represented with something negative. Remember in the book of Ruth, they went from the house of bread, Bethlehem, to the field of Moab, to the fields of Moab. And if you know in Deuteronomy chapter 23, there is a story there of the betrothed woman who is not yet married, and a man tries to rape her, and it happened in the field. And because it happened in the field, even if she would have screamed, nobody would have heard her, and therefore it's like a murder. And the man is guilty, and the woman is completely innocent because it happened in the field. The field is an unprotected area. Also in Deuteronomy, there is a story of if you find a corpse of a dead person falling in the field, and nobody knows who killed this person. So you go to the elders of the closest city, and the elders have a ceremony, and they bring a heifer, they bring a young cow, and they slaughter the cow. And the elders of the city have to wash their hands in the blood of the cow and say, our hands did not slay this person. Do you remember that story from Deuteronomy? I'll tell you where it is, so you can find it. But again, the metaphor of falling in the field, in the unprotected area, that's the end of Kitetse. No, it's not the end of Kitetse. A moment. It's in Deuteronomy chapter. It's Deuteronomy chapter 20, 21, verse 1. 21, verse 1. You'll find the exact same thing of the use of the field. Again, Deuteronomy 21, capitolul 21, and the prima verse. Can you see it? You want to see it in Romanian?
Yes, I found it.
Yes, would you like to read it?
Dacă în țara pe care Domnul Dumnezeul tău ți-o dă în stăpânire se găsește un om ucis, întins în mijlocul unui câmp, fără să se știe cine l-a lovit, bătrânii și judecătorii tăi să se ducă să măsoare depărtarea de la trupul mort până la cetățile de prin prejur. And further?
Oh, anyhow, so what happens is there's a famous statement where the elders have to say, our hands did not make this blood. meaning the blood is not stained. In English, you also say, our hands are not stained with blood. And it's taken from this story. But the story starts with a body that's found in the field. Again, the field becomes a very negative. It's like if you're reading, let's say, if you're watching a movie, an Agatha Christie movie, which is talking about a murder, and right before the murder takes place, you'll hear the music, right? Dum-dum-dum, or something like that. Or there'll be or the camera will focus on a dark alley, and then it prepares you that something's going to happen. So the same thing in the biblical narrative, when there's a field, an empty field, you know something bad is going to happen. Okay, so it only becomes a literary motif in the Bible that empty fields are bad things, unless it's field which is full with grain and blessing. So, so there are a few stories like this of the fields. So I'm just saying that the biblical narrative also uses these type of metaphors commonly. And this can be seen in, like I said, also the verse that leaves something out. And Cain said to Abel, his brother, but we don't know what he said because it's not important what he said. But you have to pick up those little nuances because it's talking to you through the style also of the. So in general, what I'm trying to say is that biblical narrative, because as prophetic narrative, uses symbols and metaphors openly. Because these are the means through which it's trying to talk to us in various ways, aside from what the actual narrative. There's the meta narrative on top of the narrative, and you have to be able to pick up these things. Okay, so I think I'm going to hold it at that, unless you want to hear more about this, but there's really a lot to say about this, but because it goes on and on and on, but I'll give you another example of the about Noah. If you look at Genesis chapter 6, Capitulul 6, and verse 9, it's the beginning of the story of Noah. See where it says, and these are the generations of Noah. You can see that? It's verse 9 in chapter 6.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, who would like to read?
Iată care sunt urmașii lui Noe.
Yeah.
Noe era un om neprihănit și fără pată între cei din vremea lui.
Okay, so he walked with the God. Now, already the first verse is interesting. It says that Noah was a righteous man in his generation. What does that mean? Does that mean only in his generation? Meaning if he was in a different generation, we wouldn't consider him righteous? Is that a relativistic statement? In other words, it almost sounds like the Bible is making a comparison between Noah and, let's say, the generation of Abraham. So Noah, in his generation, he was righteous. What does that mean? Does that mean that he could have done things that he didn't do? It's not clear. When you say this person is very righteous in his generation. Why do you have to say in his generation? Do you mean that the generation was so bad that he looked righteous in comparison? Or do you mean that if he was in a bad generation, he was righteous, so in a righteous generation, he would be more righteous, right? There are two possibilities of understanding that, and it's not clear what you mean. But obviously you mean to say something, or else you would just say he was righteous. Right? In the book of Job, God says to Satan, he says, Job is a righteous man. And the narrative says he's a righteous man. But about Noah, it says he's righteous in his generation. So we have to now figure out what that means. So this is a controversy in rabbinic literature. Did it mean that Noah was a very righteous person or a relatively righteous person? Many think it means relatively. Now look what else it says. It says about Noah in that same verse, Et ha-Elohim italech Noach, which means Noach walked with God. Noach walked with God. Now let me just give you a comparison to another verse. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Okay, look at Genesis, but we'll keep Noach on one, keep your hand there too. Genesis chapter 48, verse 15. Remember here it says Noach walked with God. Now look at Genesis chapter 48, verse 15. Capitolul 48, verse 15. When Jacob is blessing the children of Joseph. So what does he say? It says he blessed Joseph. Somebody find it?
Yeah. Și
Please.
el a binecuvântat.
Okay.
Vreau să spun.
Yes, Ilana.
Și el a binecuvântat pe Iosif și a zis, Dumnezeul înaintea căruia au umblat părinții mei, Avram și Isaac, Dumnezeul care m-a păstorit de când m-am născut până în ziua aceasta.
Okay, do you see what it says here?
Yeah.
God, whom my forefathers Abraham and Isaac walked in front of him. It says that Noah walked with God and Abraham and Isaac walked in front of God. What's the difference of walking in front or with? In front means I know where to go. With means I have no clue where to go. God, you tell me, that's where I'll go. In front means I am morally autonomous. I am self-propelled. I know where I'm going. I understood. You taught me well. I can now run ahead. But Noah was not able to run ahead. He had to walk hand in hand with God. That's called with God instead of in front. And I'll show you one other place where you can also see a hint like this. I don't want Noah to get angry with me. I'm just saying that the text seems to hint that it could be that he was not on that same level. If you look the previous verse, back to Genesis chapter 6, verse 8, where it says, and Noah found grace in God's eyes.
Like favor.
Favor, how do you say that in Romanian?
Că a avut favoare.
El a-
Yes, please, Adela, how do you say it?
Yes, favoare. A
Okay,
fost
favor, yes.
favoare în fața lui Dumnezeu.
So it's very
Har
interesting.
e la mine.
So let me show you something. In Hebrew,
Har.
okay, in Hebrew, Noach is spelled nun chet. Noach. And favor in Hebrew is spelled chet nun. It's the final nun. Chen. It's the same letters of Noach, but backwards. There's a play on words here. Noah found favor. Nun chet found chet nun. And you start wondering, what does that mean? There's obviously a play on words here because it's the same word backwards. And it says Noah found favor, nun chet, found chet nun in God's eyes. What does it mean to find favor in God's eyes? In my opinion, this is also a metaphor. When you look in somebody's eyes, you see a reflection of yourself in the pupil of their eye. Yes? If you look very closely at somebody, you will see your image in their eyes backwards. Right? Because a person's eye picks up the picture backwards and then the brain turns it around forwards. So when you look in somebody's eye like a mirror, you see yourself backwards. So when Noah looked into God's eyes, he was able to see himself, but he sees himself backwards. That's called Noah, nun chet, found favor, chet nun, God's eyes. He sees a reflection of himself backwards. Why does Noah keep looking in God's eyes? Because he keeps wanting to know what God wants from me, because he himself doesn't know. He has to keep asking. So the difference between Noah and Abraham is that Abraham is self-propelled. Abraham is autonomous. He knows what God wants, so he can run forward. But Noah wants to do the right thing, but he doesn't really know 100% what God wants. That's another hint to the level that Noah's on compared to the level of Abraham. That I'm just giving you then symbolism from the text, that the text plays around with words sometimes, especially you can see this in the Hebrew language, and it plays around with metaphors and symbols, and sometimes that words that come back again and again. And you can pick it up sometimes very in interesting ways when you look at it. Also, by the way, the word Noach in Hebrew means comfort. Comfort.
But there is an alteration in the translation in English when you say that found favor, because what you say, it's another meaning. Right?
I say Noach found favor in God's eyes, but I'm saying it's chet nun becomes nun chet. There's a play on words on purpose in order to use this metaphor of looking in God's eyes to see your own image.
Yeah, but you can't figure this out in the translation.
That's
right?
correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
For that,
So
you
it's
need to
alteration
know.
of
That's right. You need to see the Hebrew letters in order to get those, to see the riddles that are going on at the time.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Just like you need to know that Bethlehem in the book of Ruth actually means the house of bread, which you might not realize in the translation, but in Hebrew it is Beit Lechem, which literally means the house of bread, which is also the name of the city. So so I'm just saying you have to pick up on these things, and it's all part of the biblical narrative. I want to say one other thing, and then I want to go on because I want to talk about the oral tradition. There are two ways of looking at the Bible. You can look at the Bible, or well, there are probably more than two ways, but I want to talk about two major ways. You can look at the Bible as a literary text, just like you look at any literary text. Shakespeare or Charles Dickens or whatever. But there's something about the Bible, which in my opinion, it transcends a literary text. There's just so much going on within the text itself that when you discover these things, you feel like I didn't discover them, they were planted there. That's the feeling you get. You discover things all the time, and then you figure out this was obviously on purpose. So, in Shakespeare, you can discover something and wonder if actually Shakespeare meant that. But when you in the Bible, sometimes you feel like it was just waiting to be discovered. And the interesting thing is that sometimes after so many generations of commentators, there seems to be new stuff that are still to be discovered in that ancient text. And so this is the feeling I get, that you have to look beyond the literary text. If you want to be inspired by the Bible, then it will inspire you. But if not, it'll just look like a literary text. Yeah. It's sort of like a boy and a girl going on their first date. Okay. So, and let's say if one of the sides is not interested, so they had a nice dinner together, but it meant nothing. But if they look in each other's eyes and they start feeling something, all of a sudden it was a magical experience, right? And it's the same thing. So that's what happens. Sometimes when you look for something in the Bible and you're looking for it to inspire you, then it replies and it gives you something to take home with you. That's my subjective feeling. I can't prove that. Except for that's been my experience. That's why you have so many people call themselves biblical scholars, but they were never looking for anything. Years ago, I met I met somebody here in Jerusalem who had gone from Russia to England. They were living in England, and they had a brother. It was very interesting. They were not Jewish, but their brother was studying in yeshiva in Israel. Yeshiva is, a religious academy for the study of Torah. What happened was her father had remarried. So she was born from the non-Jewish mother, and her brother was born from the Jewish mother, and her brother went to study in yeshiva in a little town next to Jerusalem. So she came to visit him, and she was very interested in everything that was happening. And, I think she got a little bit of Jerusalem syndrome, but it was anyhow. So, Jerusalem syndrome is an actual psychological disease. It's actually listed in the books, where a person feels like they're the Messiah, or they're God, or it's called Jerusalem syndrome. You can look it up. So she had a little bit of that. So I remember at that time, there was Richard Dawkins from England had just come out with his book Against Religion. There was another fellow whose name was Hutchins, I think, or Hitchens, also, who came out with this book, which was called, what do they call it? I can't remember. It's a long time ago. It was like 15 years ago. There were two books that came out, were very big attacks against religion. One of them, Richard Dawkins.
Selfish gene.
Sorry?
Selfish gene. Selfish gene.
The Selfish Gene, that was Richard Dawkins?
Yes, he has one. I have the book.
You know what? Let me look it up. Let me see the name of I don't remember if that was the one, but I think it was another one. Okay, hold on. The God Delusion, that was the one. God Delusion. He wrote a book called The God Delusion. So I remember she just came from England. So I said to her, "You're from London, and you came to Jerusalem, and you're on this spiritual journey. What is your opinion of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion?" For some reason, I don't know, I asked her that question. She said to me, "People like Richard Dawkins don't understand what a spiritual journey is." And I think she's right. Haven't seen her since, but to this day, I
Can you
remember
find
that.
it?
But what?
I went upstairs. This is.
You got it. Well, you got everything. My goodness.
Yes.
Amazing. Yes. So
And
I
I
actually.
wanted earlier I wanted to show you this.
Oh,
You know
Dan
this guy?
Ariely. He's good. Yes, he's good. I have one of his books
It
too.
says the upside of predictably irrational. He said that we are not rational.
Right here.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, I don't have the Romanian copy though. Okay, I see. I see.
Yeah.
We have big scholars in this group. I have
Because
to be careful.
in the beginning you said that we are not using our rationality as much as we use our emotions.
A lot
So
of
this guy
psychologists talk
wrote a
about
lot
this.
about-
Yes.
Yes.
That doesn't mean the human being is not a rational being, but we
No, I didn't say
don't
that.
always, we use
But
our rationality to correct our mistakes more than we use it to make the actual decisions.
Yes, indeed.
There was a
That's
book
it.
written by Gert Gergerenzer from Germany, and it's called Gut Feelings. The name of the book is called Gut Feelings. He's a psychologist, and he says that human beings have a tendency to use our intuitions more than we use our rational reasoning. But our reasoning is there to correct mistakes. And he gives an example of Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin from early American history, who is both a politician and a scientist. So he said there's a story, he had a nephew, and his nephew came over to him and says, "Uncle Franklin, I met two girls, and I don't know which one to marry." Says, "This one is like this one's like that." So Franklin said to him, "Okay, I have a suggestion. You make a list of all the positive and negative traits of both these girls, the pros and the cons, And then when you inspect the list, the one who has more pros than cons, that's the one that you should marry. Because you're making the list, so obviously this is the way you see it. He said, thank you very much. He went home, he made a list of the pros and the cons of each one of the girls. And then when he made the list, he realized, I can't remember the names, let's say Sarah and Betty, okay? So he made the list for Sarah, made the list for Betty, and then he realized that the list for Betty, there's more pros and cons. So according to his uncle, that's the one he should marry. But he didn't want to marry that one. So he came back to the uncle, he said, I decided to marry Sarah. But by making the list and seeing that he was supposed to marry one, he realized that's not the one he wants. But that was a gut feeling, that was not reason. So he uses that as an example. So a lot of decisions that we make in life, it's a gut feeling, but it's not divorced from our faculty of reason, but it's something else. They like saying holistic nowadays. It's something else. It's coming from a different part of our personality. Anyhow, the brain, but just in the West, we've been taught that the brain has to think logically and nothing else. But there are other parts to human reason, the faculty of the intellect, which are not just 1 and 1 is 2. There are other ways that we perceive things. Take, for instance, Immanuel Kant, who talks about a priori understanding. All of human ethics is a priori. It is very hard to prove that ethics is correct, but the average person understands that it's true. It's very hard to prove that it's wrong to steal, but most people understand that if it doesn't belong to me and it belongs to you, then it's not right for me to take it away from you. So that's an ethical idea. But if you try to prove it, it's very difficult. So what are you going to say? I'm not going to steal from you so that you don't steal from me. Okay. In other words, if you couldn't steal from me, then I could steal from you. Is that the argument? The argument falls short. Or when you talk about the sanctity of human life, don't kill people because they might kill you. Oh, so if I'm Superman and I'm invincible, then it's okay, right? No, that wasn't the point. So I'm just saying every argument you use to try to prove ethics always falls short, because ethics is something that we understand a priori, by the faculty of reason, but a priori, it's very hard to prove it. You either know it or you don't. Geometry is the same, by the way. Some of the axiomatic statements of geometry can be proven, some of them cannot. The idea that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, I know that before I prove it. Some of the axiomatic statements of geometry, even though they're true, they're called axioms because some of them I can prove, some of them I cannot. Like 2 parallel lines will never meet. How do you know? Have you followed them until infinity? You have not. So how do you know that 2 parallel lines will never meet? I just know it. Right? That's called an axiomatic statement. There's no way to prove it, but everybody knows it's true. Understand what I'm saying? So there are things within the human psyche that we know for sure it's correct, but we're not exactly sure how to prove it. Okay, we got a little off the topic. You have to watch out because I like these discussions. A little bit off the topic. So let me just summarize so that we can continue. I was trying to give you examples of the way biblical literature uses metaphors and symbols. And in my opinion, that's all symptomatic of the prophetic way of thinking. Because all these come through prophets, and prophets are constantly using symbols and metaphors, so therefore the biblical narrative itself is full of symbols and metaphors. It's just, as I said, a product of the prophetic style of writing literature. And every time you find something, it was planted there on purpose, in my opinion. Just waiting for you to notice it. So you can still notice it in the translation, but obviously knowing the language helps with these things. That's all. Okay? Question? Okay, I would like to go further now because even though this is a topic that was close to my heart, I want to continue by explaining now what is the oral tradition of Judaism. Torah shebal peh, the Torah that was verbal, never written down. So let me look for that piece of paper and see if I can find it. I can't do that. I can do. Wait a second. It's right here. Right here. Sorry. Right over here. Okay. How do we do this? Okay, I'm not continuing with the book of Ruth. How far did I get in the book of Ruth? I don't remember how far I got. Did I finish chapter 1 with you?
Yes, I think so.
Where Ruth makes her famous statement, your people is my people, your God is my God.
I guess just chapter 1, yes.
We did that. No, but we finished chapter 1.
Yes.
Oh, okay. That's okay. That's fine. By the way, that statement in chapter 1 of Ruth is taken very seriously by Jewish law in the laws of conversion. Because the first thing I think I told you, that you see a potential convert, you say to them, what is your relationship to the Jewish people? And then you explain to them the one God and that there's commandments, because a person can't say, well, Judaism, that's very interesting. But the Jews, I'm not so interested. If it was Rabbi Akiba and Moses, maybe, but it's a package deal. When you join, it's like joining in a family. You get, there's lots of people in that family and you have to sort of like deal with it. And the opposite too. When a person converts, they can't say, I like the Jews, but that Torah doesn't make any sense. Again, it's a package deal. So, yeah. It's interesting how it became, from that verse, it made its way into Jewish law. Okay, I'm jumping over this now. And this. Okay. What is the oral tradition? And why is there an oral tradition? Why is there a verbal tradition? What's wrong with the 24 books of the Bible? What's wrong with the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the 8 books of the prophets, including the minor prophets, which are another 12, and the Hagiographa? Why do we need more? I'm glad you asked me that question. We're not the only tradition that has that. In the Islam, you have the Hadith, which is sort of like their oral tradition, their interpretations, but it's a little bit different than ours. We claim that the verbal Torah, meaning the explicacias of Torah, came together with the Torah itself. And that it wasn't written down in order for it wasn't actually allowed to be written down. That is the argument. How am I going to explain this? How can I prove this? Give you an example. To give you an example, I have to bring, I'll write it right here. Okay, it's hard to write on the whiteboard of this thing. 1 second. Go back to here again. And we're right here. Okay. Let me just read to you Maimonides' Introduction to the Mishnah. Mishnah is the first corpus of the verbal tradition. Concerning the oral Torah, know that each commandment the Holy One, blessed be he, gave to Moses, our teacher, peace be upon him, was given to him with its explicatia, with the explanation. He would say to them the commandment, and afterwards tell him the explanation and content. And so to everything that's included in the book of the Torah and the manner of its teaching to Israel. Moses would enter the tent and Aaron would enter first, and Moses would tell him the commandment that was given to him, and teach him explanation one time, and then to Eleazar, then to Itamar, and the 70 elders, and then to all of Israel. Okay, is there a way of proving that? In my opinion, there are 2 ways of proving it. One is logically, one is inference from some of the places in the Torah. Let me start with the logically one. If you look in the Torah, in Parshat Emor, let me find exactly where. 1 second, I will find it. Okay, Leviticus 23:40. Leviticus 23:40. Leviticus 23:40. Capitolul 23, verse 40.
You shall not eat bread. That's the one.
It starts off, no, you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of the tree Hadar. Maybe the verses are numbered differently in your Bible.
În ziua întâi să luați asta?
Do you see that? Is it verse 40 in chapter
Yes.
23? Okay, so please.
Yes.
We said, moment, we said
Mm.
Leviticus.
Sorry. În ziua întâi să luați ramuri de copaci frumoși, ramuri de finici, ramuri de copaci cu frunze late și sălci de râu și să vă veseliți înaintea Domnului Dumnezeului vostru 7 zile. Asta?
Yeah, it's 40 though, number 40. You shall take for yourselves on
Yes,
the first
number
day.
40.
Yeah, the fruit
Yes.
of a tree Hadar, the branches of a palm tree, the boughs of thick-leaved
Yes.
trees, and the willows of the brook. So
I think there are two different translations. Mirala's got one, and I think I have another one.
Okay, let's hear your translation.
În ziua întâi să luați fructe din pomii cei frumoși, ramuri de palmier.
Tell me what it means, because my Romanian is not very good.
Fructe are fruit from
Yes.
the beautiful trees,
Yes,
and branches of palm trees, branches of trees with leaves, and I don't remember salci in English.
willow.
Willows, yeah, willows, of course.
So okay, very good. Let's go with that. That's more or less what it says in the Hebrew. So it says, you shall take on the first day of this holiday, the fruit of nice tree, which in Hebrew is called Hadar, a branch of thick tree, which in Hebrew is called avot, which could be translated as thick. Sorry. A palm branch, with that one we know what that is, and a willow. That also we know. So we have 4 things that we're supposed to take, and only 2 of them do we know what they are. We know what a palm branch is. We know what a willow tree is, the ones that have the leaves that, look like it's a crying tree. But the first one doesn't make sense. What is the first, it says take on the first day of the holiday, fruit of a nice tree. What's fruit of a nice tree? Is that an apple? Is that an orange? Is it a pomegranate? What is it? Is it a lemon? It could be anything. And what is the branch of a thick tree? What's the thick tree? Now today, does anybody know what we call that festival? What is the festival called? It's the Festival of Tabernacles. And in Hebrew, it's called Sukkot. Sukkot, where we sit in a booth, a hut, right? We have pizza in the hut. So we sit in a hut and we put branches on top, but we also carry in the synagogue 4 different types of species. We have a palm branch. The fruit that we use is called etrog, which is a citron. It's related to the lemon, but it's a different species. It sort of looks like a very bumpy lemon. I might still have one here. Okay, unfortunately, it got all dried up. Once upon a time, it was much bigger than this. But this is, right, it's a little bumpy and it has, right, it used to be much bigger. Actually, it looks much bigger on the Zoom than it is in actuality, but because it all got dried out. But it still has a fragrance, which is interesting. So, so we use this etrog, the citron, for the nice fruit, and the branch of the thick tree, we use the myrtle. The myrtle, which is called in Hebrew hadas, which has these little leaves going around on the tree, 3 at a time, going on the tree. But how do you know that? How do you know that the nice fruit is an etrog? Without an explicatia, there is no way to know. But I'm going to assume that when the people of Israel saw in the Torah that they're supposed to have 4 species on the festival of tabernacles on Sukkot, they probably walked over to Moses and said, Moses, we would love to do this. Can you tell us what we're supposed to be doing? Right? That would be the first thing. So logically, if you have to keep this, and if the verses are not clear, the first question is, what are we supposed to do? I'll give you another example. It says in the Torah in 4 different places, twice in the Decalogue, meaning the Decalogue in Exodus and the Decalogue in Deuteronomy. It says you have to remember the Sabbath day to watch over it. 6 days you shall do your toil, and on the 7th day you shall rest. You shall not do any work on the 7th day. Lo taseh kol melacha, neither you, neither you, nor your servant, nor your maidservant, nor your son, nor your daughter, nobody is supposed to do work. But what is the definition of work? Who decides what work is? Is work going to work? Remember, there was no going to work in the desert. There was nowhere to go. So what's the definition? You're in the desert. What is the definition of work? Now, in the oral Torah, there is a tradition of 39 categories of work. But if you don't have definitions, the statement is useless. How can you say don't do any work, but you don't explain what it is? How can you have a law without an explanation? So obviously the people probably came over to Moses and said, Moses, we have a problem. It says not to work on the Sabbath. What does that mean? Now, I'm going to show you 2 cases in the Torah where that happened exactly. Okay? Let's go back to our thing here. Case number 1, actually, this is case number 1, but then there's case number 2. It's called the Mikalel. Yeah, excuse me. One moment. Second. Okay, this is the book of Numbers, chapter 15, verse 32. Numbers 15, verse 32. $15, I think it was.
And you should not fulfill.
One moment. Numbers, we said, I think 15. 32, let me find it.
When the children of Israel.
It says, and while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, that's the one.
Yeah.
They found a man gathering sticks.
Wood, it's in my translation.
Yeah, actually in Hebrew it says chopping wood. But okay, so who would like to read it? It's verses 32 to 36. No, actually it's enough, just 32 to 34. That's enough. Somebody have it in Romanian? Numbers
Okay.
15, 32,
Yes.
33, and 34.
32. Când
Ok.
erau copiii lui Israel în pustie, au găsit pe un om strângând lemne în ziua sabatului. Cei ce-l găsiră strângând lemne l-au adus la Moise, la Aron și la toată adunarea. L-au aruncat în temniță, căci nu se spusese ce trebuie să-i facă.
Okay, so they saw a man who was chopping wood or gathering sticks on the Sabbath, and they didn't know what to do. Why didn't they know what to do? Because they were wondering, is this considered work on the Sabbath, yes or no? Right? They weren't clear. They went to Moses. They said, Moses, we know he did something wrong, but we don't know what he did wrong. So you tell us. Here we have an example of the oral tradition in the written tradition. They walk over to Moses, say, Moses, we think he did something wrong. We're not sure. And Moses was not sure. He asked God. Let me give you a second one. Leviticus, second example of this. This is Numbers 27:2. Daughters of Slofhad. Right? Numbers 27, verse 2. Also in Numbers 27, verse 2.
They stood before Moses.
One moment, let me find it. Numbers 27, verse 2. Start from the beginning, verse 1. From 1 until 6. No, from 1 until 7. Would somebody like to read? 27, 1 until 7 in the book of Numbers.
Begins with fetele lui Slofhad.
Right, the daughters of Slofhad, yes.
I have an old Bible and is written Slofhad.
Okay, that's fine.
Fiul lui
Slofhad.
Hefer, fiul lui Hefer, fiul lui
Right.
Galad, fiul
Right.
lui Machir, fiul lui Manase, din familiile lui Manase, fiul lui Iosif, și ale căror nume erau Mahla, Noa, Hogla, Milca și Tirța. S-au apropiat și s-au înfățișat înaintea lui Moise, înaintea preotului Eleazar, înaintea mai marilor și înaintea întregei adunări la ușa cortului întâlnirii. Ele au zis: Tatăl nostru a murit în pustie. El nu era în mijlocul cetei celor ce s-au răzvrătit împotriva Domnului, în mijlocul cetei lui Core, ci a murit pentru păcatul lui și n-a avut fii. Pentru ce să se stingă numele tatălui nostru din mijlocul familiei lui, pentru că n-a avut fii? Dă-ne și nouă deci o moștenire între frații tatălui nostru. Moise a adus pricina lor înaintea Domnului. Domnul a zis lui Moise.
One more verse.
Ok. Fetele lui Slofhad au dreptate. Să le dai de moștenire o moșie între frații tatălui lor și să treci asupra lor moștenirea tatălui lor.
Right. And then he says, this is what to tell all of the people of Israel. So it's interesting. You have the 5 daughters of Slofhad from the tribe of Manasseh. Now, according to Torah law in the book of Deuteronomy, when a man dies, the sons inherit. And the oldest son gets 2 portions. The oldest son. So the daughters of Slofhad came over to Moses and said, our father died and he had no sons. What's supposed to happen now? And Moses didn't know. So, because the law says to the sons. So then he turned to God and said, God, what do we do with these 5 daughters of Slofhad? God says, they said correctly, when there are no sons, it goes to the daughter. So here we have an explicatia of the law of inheritance, but we have it verbally, meaning they asked Moses, Moses asked God, God told them. Okay, so you have the beginning here, you have a hint to the explanations that were going on during the 40 years of the desert. And if we just saw 2 examples of this, there must have been hundreds and hundreds of examples like this. And maybe every day there were people asking these questions. Because if you remember the story, Moses would sit from morning till evening and take questions from people. And Jethro, his uncle, said to him, Moses, you can't do this. You need other people to help you. You need to delegate the work. And then Moses took 70 people from each tribe and he put them as judges over the people. There were the 70 elders and the judges from every tribe. So these people, it wasn't just that they were dealing with questions of arguments. It was also questions of the law, which had to be clarified. Because the law as it's presented in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, is not clear. There are many, many questions. That's why the roots of the oral tradition would have had to start logically already in the desert. I'll give you one more example of an oral tradition. This is an unusual example. It's in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18. It's about the king. I think it's chapter 18. No, chapter 17. They're the laws of the king. Chapter 17. It says in verse 15 that if you can take upon yourself a king, which God has chosen from among your brethren. Then it says in verse 16, somebody like to read verse 16? It's Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 16. Does anybody have it? Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 16, about the king, that he's not allowed to have too many horses.
Dar să n-aibă mulți cai și să nu întoarcă pe popor în Egipt ca să aibă mulți cai, căci Domnul v-a zis să nu vă mai întoarceți pe drumul acela.
Thank you. So he's not allowed to have too many horses, and he cannot cause the people to return to Egypt because horses came from Egypt at that time. Since God has said to you, you shall never return in that way again, meaning God told you never to go back to Egypt. Rashi, the famous commentator from France in the 11th century, says, where did God say that you're not allowed to go back to Egypt? It doesn't say that anywhere in the 5 books of Moses. So what does it say? And God told you you cannot go back to Egypt. Obviously, this was verbal, and it was never written down in the Pentateuch, because there's no verse like that. But the verse says that God told you cannot go back to Egypt, so he must have said you can't go back to Egypt, but it's not in the 5 books of Moses. Another interesting example of a verbal tradition which is not in the written tradition. So these are just hints to the fact that they must have had some explicatia which started with Moses, and Moses was explaining to them how to do this, how to do that. Now, some of our traditions we can trace back, let's say, archaeologically. But even when you trace something back archaeologically, the best you can do is the Second Temple period. It's very hard to find archaeological things from before that. Certain things in the Bible, yes. Like take, for instance, what I talked about before, the etrog, right? That fruit that we carry around on tabernacles, which is like a lemon. So there is a story in the Talmud that when under Agrippus the first, who was during the time of the Hasmoneans, he was one of the Hasmonean kings, which is 1st century before the Common Era. It could be actually the beginning. Yeah, it's the beginning of the 1st century before the Common Era, Agrippus. So Agrippus sometimes would keep the law according to the Sadducees and not according to the Pharisees. And it says because he did that on tabernacles, all the people threw their etrogim at him. So we know for sure that they used etrogim in that day because they stoned him with their etrogim, their etrogs, their lemons that they were using in the Festival of Tabernacles. Sometimes we also find things, obviously, in archaeology about the written Bible. Like, for instance, these are already in the field of archaeology. For instance, there's the Siloam pool in Jerusalem. In Hebrew, the Shiloach. There's a story in the book of Kings 2 about Hezekiah, who wanted to make sure that Jerusalem would have a water source where they could have Appa freely in the city. And so he made a tunnel. And he made the tunnel, it dug down from the city of David all the way to the Gihon Funtuna. There's a spring called the Gihon. So they made a subterranean tunnel from the city of David outside the walls of the city, which came up right where the tunnel was. And this tunnel, which is called Hezekiah's tunnel, is still there to this day. And when the British came here during the British, actually before the British Mandate, but they were only in charge during the British Mandate. That's when they did most of their theft, both here and in. Right, that's how they have the British Museum. They just stole from all the countries that they were in, from Egypt, from Israel, which was Palestine, they called it, and from Assyria and Iraq and all the places where they were. So they discovered there was engraved in that cave was the exact engraving of Hezekiah's workers, which said, King Hezekiah commanded us to make this tunnel, and this is where we met, exactly like the story in the book of Kings, where they met exactly at the same point because they started from the two sides and they met in the middle, which was quite an engineering feat for those days. It was not a simple thing to do. So they found the plaque from Hezekiah, and you can see it today in the British Museum. And the tunnel, of course, is still there. So there are a lot of interesting things in archaeology, but the archaeology can't always prove everything about the commandments and the way they kept them. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes things are a little bit, it's just hard to go back that far. But so I'm just saying that when you have, sometimes the verses themselves, you can infer that they had things like this, that they had such explanations. I can give you one other example if you want, but there are many places you can see examples like this. I'll give you one other example in the book of Exodus about the laws of Shabbat. Let me try to find it from Professor Google. Okay, wait, I'm having difficulty finding it. Hold on. Okay, this is in Exodus 16:23. Exodus 16:23. Again, Exodus chapter 16, verse 23. We can start from verse 22 and then verse 23. Has anybody found it? It's about the manna,
Yes.
the manna that fell in the desert. And
Yes.
verse 22 says that they used to collect it on Friday before the Sabbath. Right, that's verse 22. That they collected it early in the morning.
În ziua
And it was-
aceasta.
Yeah, who has it? Verse 22 and 23. Anybody have it? Monica,
Yes.
did you find it?
Yes.
Okay, please. Vero.
În ziua a 6-a au strâns hrană îndoiți, și anume 2 omeri de fiecare. Toți fruntașii adunării au venit și au spus lui Moise lucrul acesta.
Okay, in verse 23,
Și Moise le-a zis, Domnul a poruncit așa, mâine este ziua de odihnă, șabatul, închinat Domnului. Coaceți ce aveți de copt, fierbeți ce aveți de fiert și păstrați până a doua zi, dimineață, tot ce va rămânea.
okay. So Moses says, first of all, the manna fell twice on Friday. And so they picked it up on Friday. And then on verse 23, Moses says to them, whatever you want to bake, bake. Whatever you want to cook, cook. But tomorrow is the Sabbath. You're not going to find it in the field. The very fact that Moses says to them, whatever you want to bake, bake. Whatever you want to cook, cook. But not tomorrow. You can infer from that you're not supposed to cook or bake on the Sabbath. But nowhere in the Torah does it say you're not allowed to cook or bake on the Sabbath. But we know from the tradition of the oral Torah that you're not allowed to cook and bake on the Sabbath. But obviously they must have known that. Or why would Moses say that to them? You understand? In other words, they must have known that they're not allowed to cook and bake on the Sabbath, or else why would Moses actually say that? So from this, we can infer that they knew that piece of knowledge that we have in our tradition, but it's not written in the 5 books of Moses. I'll give you one last example, and we'll call it a day. Okay. This example comes from much, much later in the Bible, from the book of Jeremiah. I think it's Jeremiah 17, if I remember correctly, but if not, I'll check. I think it's in 17. No, it's not 17. Let me look up again in Mr. Google. Jeremiah 17:21. It was 17. 17:21.
Așa grăiește Domnul.
Wait, let me find it. You're faster than I am.
Aveți grijă de sufletele voastre acolo?
Wait a second. No, oh, I understand. I was looking at Isaiah. That's why I couldn't find it. One moment. Hold it. Okay, you're much faster than I am. Jeremiah 17:21. Yes. Okay, so let's start from 19. Verse 19, where God says to him to stand at the gate. Verse 19.
Așa grăiește Domnul, du-te și stai în porțile fiilor poporului tău, cele prin care intră regii lui Iuda și prin care ies, și în toate porțile Ierusalimului.
Yeah.
Și le vei, yes.
Continue.
Yeah. Și le vei zice, auziți cuvântul Domnului, voi, regii lui Iuda, și voi, toată Iudeea, și voi, Ierusalimul întreg, voi, cei ce intrați prin porțile acestea. Așa grăiește Domnul, aveți grijă de sufletele voastre și nu ridicați poveri în ziua de odihnă și nu le faceți să treacă prin porțile Ierusalimului. În ziua odihnei să nu scoateți poveri din casele voastre și nicio lucrare să nu faceți. Sfințiți ziua de odihnă, așa cum le-am poruncit eu părinților voștri.
Okay, so in verse 21, it says, so he's standing in the gates of Jerusalem, Jeremiah, and he says, this is what God says. Take heed to yourselves and do not carry any burdens on the Sabbath day, and don't bring anything through the gates of Jerusalem. You shall not carry forth a burden out of your homes on the Sabbath day, nor do any work on the sanctity of the Sabbath day, just as I commanded your fathers. Now, this is interesting. It says you're not allowed to carry through the gates of Jerusalem. Now, we know in Jewish law from the Talmud that you're not supposed to carry in a public area on the Sabbath. But it doesn't say that in the 5 books of Moses. So how did the people know? So if Jeremiah is standing in the gates and telling these people not to carry through these gates, obviously he knows that they know about it, and he's just warning them to be more strict about it. So you have another example here in the book of Jeremiah of a law of the Sabbath, which is not mentioned explicitly in the 5 books of Moses, but obviously everybody knows about it, or else they would say to him, we never knew that. But that's not what they're saying to him. Obviously he's feeling that they're not being strict enough, and they're carrying their burdens into the public area outside the city, which is not allowed. So my point is then that what we call the oral traditions were oral, but they actually go back quite a long way. At least the basic precepts, the basic explicatia of how to do the mitzvot, of how to do the commandments, this goes back a very long way. But in every generation where there are new circumstances, discussions have to take place. So that is my introduction to the discussion of the verbal tradition, what we call the oral Torah. So let's look a little bit here. So this we talked about over here. Daughters of Slofhad. Okay. Well, if the oral Torah was not written down, so why was it eventually written down? So this is the reason that we have from Rav Shvira Gaon. Shvira Gaon lives in the 10th century in Babylonia. He's one of what's called the Geonim. And he wrote an epistle, a letter, called the Letter of Shvira Gaon, where he gives us the history, the chronology of the development of the writing of the oral Torah. We know a lot of details from this letter of Shvira Gaon. So Shvira says like this: in the land of Israel, where you had the high court in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was the center of life of the southern kingdom. So if there were arguments between people, they could go to the courts, they could go to the high court, and the court would solve the problem. That's it. So basically, if there were disputes, it was not a big problem. And it didn't even matter that you had difference of opinions in one city or another, as long as it wasn't on basic issues. In fact, the fact that the laws are not written down gives a certain flexibility to the judge. Once it's written down, then the law is like A and not like B. If it's not written down, you can have various opinions and various alternatives within Judaism. When you write something down, it becomes more narrow and more focused. I'll give you an example. It says in the Torah, you're not supposed to cook a kid goat in its mother's milk. Twice in the book of Exodus and once in the book of Deuteronomy. Not to cook a kid goat in its mother's milk. How do you say a goat?
Capra.
Cabra. So you're not allowed to cook the child of the goat who you killed in the milk, in the lapta of the mother. From that we learn that we're not supposed to eat milk and meat together or cook it together. The Talmud actually says you're not supposed to cook it together, eat it together, or even profit from milk and meat that was cooked together. So the question is, what is milk and meat? What is that? Well, milk we know, but what's meat? So basically, Rabbi Akiba in the 1st century says that meat includes domestic animals and wild animals, but of course we're talking about kosher animals because Jews only eat kosher animals. So we're talking about domestic animals like a cow and a goat and sheep that are in the farm. And we're also talking about wild animals like deer. Deer is also a kosher animal, for instance, and buffalo. The question is, does it include birds? So everybody knows that it shouldn't include birds because birds are birds. They're not animals, right? They're not regular animals. But Rabbi Akiba said it should include birds too, because when you're eating the bird meat, it's sometimes you can't tell that it came from a bird or from a sheep. If you're eating a shawarma, which is on the brochette, and cooking on the rotisserie, so the shawarma of the sheep and the shawarma of the turkey sometimes look very similar. So Rabbi Akiva thought it was wrong to eat, meaning what we call for rabbinic fence. You're not supposed to have even turkey together with milk, or even chicken, pui, together with milk. However, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who was a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, disagreed and said, look, when you make a fence around the law, it has to be similar to the law. But chicken and turkey, well, they didn't have turkey in those days, but chickens and birds are not similar at all because they don't have milk. So since it says that you're not supposed to cook a kid in its mother's milk, it has to be similar to that case. And since birds don't have milk, there's nothing wrong with eating chicken together with milk. And that's exactly what they did in the city where Rabbi Yossi Aglili was a rabbi in the 1st century Palestine, Judea at the time. So today we follow the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, but there was a lot of reason to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. But once the law has to be decided and put into a book, then you have to decide, is it according to A or according to B? You have to make a decision. So in Jewish law, once it was put into book form, it became according to Rabbi Akiva. But if you didn't put it down in a book form and there were just alternative opinions, so one person could have said this is the law, one person could have said that's the law. And that's what seems to have happened during the Second Temple period. There were multiple opinions, all based on reason and understanding of the law. After the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 by the Romans, by Titus and Vespasian, and after the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which took place from 132 to 135 of the Common Era, which was an attempt to regain control of Jerusalem from the Romans, and actually was successful for 3.5 years. You can't really say it was a major failure. In the end, it failed. But for 3.5 years, they gained back Jerusalem from the hands of the Romans. But after the destruction of, after the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt, in which, by the way, Rabbi Akiva was much in favor of. So what happened was, Rabbi Judah, who was known as Judah the President, or Judah the Prince, who was the head of the Sanhedrin at the end of the 2nd century, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, he basically came to the conclusion that now that Jews are moving to Babylonia, it's time to write things down. Because if you do not write everything down, it will be forgotten. And so he decides that everything that I can collect from the oral traditions that were verbal for the last 300 years, I am going to write down. This is the first attempt to write a book of the verbal laws of Judaism with its various opinions. Before that, if people wrote things, they wrote them for themselves, but they did not publicize it. And the name of this book is called the Mishnah. This is the book, the Mishnah. The Mishnah, the editor, the redacteur of the Mishnah is Yehuda Hanasi, which means Judah the president of the Sanhedrin, the high court, which at that time was already not in Jerusalem, because Jews were not allowed in Jerusalem at that point. The Romans banned Jews from living in Jerusalem since the destruction of the Second Temple. So at that time, the Sanhedrin, the high court, was in the north, near the city of Tiberias in the Galilee. And this is where Judah Hanasi decides to write down the traditions of the oral tradition. But he does it in a very concise way. He quotes the names of scholars over the period of 300 years, from -100 from 100 before the Common Era until his day, which is 200 of the Common Era. So people quoted in the Mishnah are people who lived over a 300-year period, mostly for the last 200 years, but a few from even the first century before the Common Era. The people that he quotes in the Mishnah are referred to as Tanaim. That's their connotation. Scholars of the Mishnah are called Tanaim. By the way, the word Mishnah is a Hebrew word. It means to teach. It says in Deuteronomy, you shall teach these words to your children and talk about them. And the Hebrew word is vishinantam, like the word Mishnah, which means a teaching. The Mishnah is written in Hebrew. It's written in the Galilee, and it includes in it names of 200 Tanaic scholars, 200 Tanaim. And this is and the editor is Yehuda Nasi. The Mishnah is found in 6 categories. The Mishnah has 6 categories to it. And the 6 categories of the Mishnah are Ziraim, which literally means the agricultural laws of the land of Israel. Ziraim literally means to plant seeds. It's the agricultural laws of the land of Israel. Like for instance, the sabbatical year and the Jubilee, and the first fruit, which came to the temple, and the tithes that were given to the Levites, and the Truma, what was given to the priest, to the Kohen, all the agricultural laws of the land of Israel. That's in part 1, which is called Ziraim. Part 2 are the laws of festivals, which is called Moed. Moed means festivals. Salvatore, right? And then the third part is called damages, Nizikin. Laws of damages, which is the laws of courts. And the fourth part is called Nashim, which means women. It's family laws. Oops. Family laws. And the fifth part is called Kiddoshim, which means sanctity. And it's the laws of the temple. And then the sixth part is called Taharot, which means purity. And it's the laws of purity. The laws of the ritual bath, which is called the mikveh, laws of priests, etc. It's called the laws of purity. These are the 6 parts of the Mishnah. In Hebrew, the 6 orders of the Mishnah, Shisha Sedarim, the 6 orders of the Mishnah, which are really categories. In each category, we have about 10 books. Every book is called a tractata, a tractate, or in Hebrew, masechet. So altogether, there are approximately 60 books of the Mishnah. 60 books found in 6 categories, about 10 books in every category. The books are not very long because even though every book has chapters, the Mishnah is written very concisely because it's the first attempt to write down the oral tradition. And therefore, Yehuda Nasi was afraid to write too much. Okay, I don't want to overburden you with all these details at one shot. It takes time, so I think we'll stop here. That's enough for today. And next time, again, I want to talk about the Mishnah and what the Mishnah is. We'll give a few examples, especially the laws of the Mishnah. It's mostly about Jewish law, and then how it's developed into the Talmud eventually in Babylonia. Okay, so I will stop the